I'm Zach. I'm working currently in Potsdam, which is just next to Berlin, at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. It's a think tank that's funded by the German government, and I work on a project called A Mindset for the Anthropocene, which is specifically about connecting or linking inner transformation and socio-ecological transformation to sustainability. My background is quite varied, though. I got a bachelor's degree in East Asian studies, so area studies focused on Chinese and Chinese culture. And then after finishing that degree in 2007, I moved to China for 5 years. I taught for a couple years, and then I got a bachelor's degree in Buddhist studies, of all things, in Taiwan for 3 years. Then I moved back to the States, where I'm originally from. I grew up in Chicago, but I moved at that time to LA to get a PhD in process studies. If you're familiar, process philosophy, nearly 100 years old, comes from originally Alfred North Whitehead, but also has antecedents in a lot of other traditions across time and space. And I'm just finishing that up now as I'm working also in Potsdam on the project. That's a little bit about me. Today's lecture is going to be about how to link, I spoke last time on Tuesday, how to link inner and outer transformation. And today's lecture is even more focused on mindfulness and the work that Christine does and the work that we do in Potsdam. There are 3 parts. First, I just want to discuss a little what is mindfulness, what are your impressions, your understandings of mindfulness, and give you a bit of a sense for the scope, both of mindfulness, but also more broadly meditation in general. No problem. And then in part 2, I want to jump into some of the critiques. That was a body of work that I did also, not so much now, but I would say a couple years ago, and I did it for about 3 years with a group of colleagues to sort of understand the limitations of mindfulness and contemplative practice more generally. And so Christine asked me to sort of go through some of the critiques of mindfulness, some of which I'm sure you're all familiar with or you've heard of in the media perhaps. And then finally, in the third part, I want to focus on how mindfulness or contemplative practice could be oriented around sustainability in particular, and give you concrete examples of work in that area, both empirical studies, but also pedagogies and curricula. And finally, I'll give you my own kind of practice or exercise, maybe to have some experience around how these dimensions link or connect. So first, I just want to sort of start the lecture with the broadest of scope, and then progressively narrow our focus down to ultimately sustainability. But I like this quote. I thought I'd start with a quote by Francisco Varela. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard. He's a very famous biologist who was doing pioneering work really on autopoiesis, on self-organizing systems and complexity in the 70s and 80s. He comes from Chile, I think, originally. But what's interesting about him is he crossed over from the sciences and his work, particularly in second-order cybernetics, into the field of contemplative studies. And he, along with the Dalai Lama and a few others, pioneered actually the field of contemplative studies, which I'm going to be presenting on today. So I thought it's appropriate to start with a quote. In this quote, he says, "If everybody would agree that their current reality is a reality, and that we essentially share is our capacity for constructing a reality, then perhaps we could all agree on a meta-agreement for computing a reality that would mean survival and dignity for everyone on the planet, rather than each group being sold on a particular way of doing things." And clearly this has a particular focus on sustainability and the state of the world that we find ourselves in, but I think it's just as applicable to any number of other things, including mindfulness and contemplative practice. Because, and I'll be presenting on this, I think mindfulness is somewhat narrowly defined for various reasons, And I would like to broaden that definition up to include topics like sustainability. And that's something I'll be discussing more about. But the main idea here that I want to take away is just, what is our frame, right? And how might we actually have what he calls a meta-agreement, a sort of dialogue, a sort of democratic discussion about what is that frame? Because often we find ourselves in our work contexts, in the world, not questioning the frame, going about reality with certain fundamental assumptions about reality and how we see that and perceive that without questioning that. So that's what I'll be discussing, certainly in the first part, but really throughout the lecture. And before I sort of give you my own experience within the field, I just want to start briefly with a 5-minute exercise right now, because I'd also like to hear from you where you're coming from. I don't quite have a sense. Clearly, you all are within the field of sustainability, but how much are you familiar with the field of contemplative studies, or what is your impression of mindfulness? And use these as sort of topics of discussion. So if you could just spend a few minutes, if you have a pen and paper, to sort of just free write. And free association writing as an exercise, I think, is nice, because it means that you don't allow your pen to leave the paper, right? So just basically like a stream of consciousness, just write what comes to mind, right? So don't think too much, right? What I want you to do is actually just think about how you associate mindfulness meditation. How do you understand mindfulness meditation? What comes to mind? Just anything. Just keep writing and don't let your pen leave the paper, and then we'll briefly share and get a sense for where we are. So as I sort of said in the structure, I first just want to contextualize mindfulness. And it sounds like I don't have to do too much work, because you all, at least collectively, put it in a lot of different contexts. And then I want to problematize what is mindfulness before we start doing work with it. And none of these things up here are per se what you would associate with mindfulness meditation. But that's my point, because in some ways they are all contemplative practices, broadly, very broadly defined. Gardening, for instance, can be a sort of reflective practice that connects one with nature, right? Dream yoga, which is below that, having a sort of awareness of one's dreaming can also really allow one to play with consciousness and understand awareness more broadly. Movies, we don't think of it often, but it's a collective ritual. And it can be contemplative if you have a disposition of reflecting upon what you're watching. And particular movies, which I'll actually show you later, this is my exercise, because this is my form of practice, because I love movies, can actually cultivate a contemplative disposition. Theater of the oppressed is a way of improvising and doing theater from a different position, from the position of one's own experience. So it can involve all of us in a room where we're sharing the experiences that we've had in a way that is almost therapeutic. Above that, some of you may know Burning Man. That's a picture of Burning Man, which is a massive cultural ritual where people come together in this desert where there is nothing, but they come together, they create a city temporarily, and they camp out and they have all of these artistic rituals of self-expression, meditation. Those are just some examples of contemplative practices, broadly defined. And the point that I'd like to just make is that every contemplative practice, including but not limited to mindfulness meditation, is within a life world. And I think that's actually what a lot of, to your question, research is missing. Both because mindfulness is conceived within an institutional context or a scientific context, but doesn't consider, to your point too, the larger context that it comes from, either from Buddhist tradition or even within the societal context in which we all operate, right? So I think it's important for research to increasingly understand that these practices, even mindfulness meditation, are embedded within life worlds. And a life world, as this diagram demonstrates, consists of, just for example, beliefs, ethics, goals, and concepts and values, which we all have, social forms, cultural norms, implicit understandings, and default intuitions, socio-political structures, institutions, physical conditions, and finally cosmovisuals, or cosmologies. So in some sense, which we all have these, right? The practice itself is oriented in different ways according to these different facets, right? So despite some people's claims, nothing is value-free, including mindfulness meditation, that it exists within a life world. And I think this is important for us if we want to start working with contemplative practice in the context of sustainability, both because it gives a much broader frame in which we can play around, experiment with, and understand the practice in relation to these lower and higher order systems and structures, but also so that the techniques themselves, the practices themselves, could be designed in a way, actually, and implemented in a way, and studied in a way, where those connections or relationships are explicit, right? And again, that's not what's typically done if you look at contemplative research or contemplative pedagogies, but there are some examples which I'll share later in the presentation. And then again, to break that down of multiple content, yeah, go ahead.
The question is, what is contemplative studies? Because
Yeah.
we had a discussion on this with Christine as well.
Yeah.
Like some guest lecturers said it's the study of contemplative practices. And then Christine said, like, no, it should be a way to do science, and you can do like any science in a contemplative way.
Yeah.
So what do you understand by contemplative studies?
Yeah.
What is it?
So it is both of the things that you mentioned in a way, right? So I think I was talking to Sana yesterday. Actually, we had a short meeting downstairs about, there's a book by Alan B. Wallace called Contemplative Science, and he's in that book understanding the field as a way of doing science. So that's the example you gave. It's not just that. But the way he describes contemplative science in that sense is coordinating or correlating first, second, and third person experience. So that first person experience, the introsubjective, what you would also do in a meditation, right, is correlated with second person, say, dialogue, interpersonal dialogue, and then a survey or something like that. And in addition, a third person mechanism like a neuroscientific study. And that contemplative science as a field, as a way of doing science, tries to coordinate these different ways of knowing. All right. And I was telling Sana that there are also research or empirical studies that have a long list of co-authors from different fields that are integrating these different ways of knowing into single studies, so that we consider these different contexts and these different ways of knowing. So that's true of the better work within the field, I would say, in the ways that certain scientists understand it as a way of practicing science. It could, exactly. So it's also not, it's maybe developed within the field of contemplative studies, but also is broadly applicable to any, and this is, again, the conversation Sana and I were having. It could be a way of doing any science, right? It could be a way of just reflexively understanding your role as a researcher and then feeding that back into the science. And so that in this sense, then the contemplation, right, is just elucidating what one's own positionality is, what one's own biases are, how that informs the science, right? So that's totally the case. But then as a field also, it does traditionally focus on contemplative practice, your first point. And contemplative practice, and I have actually later, I'll just show it now, is broadly defined, although mindfulness meditation gets the larger share of research and attention and funding. There are so many other practices that are included, like yoga, we all know, right? But this is a popular image within the field to communicate some of the diversity of practices, right? And if you can see, yeah, you can, okay, so there are these sort of titles that also group the practices into certain categories: movement-based practices, activist practices, generative practices, right? And they're coming from all different traditions, both East and West, right? Christian, Buddhist, Taoist. So that just gives you a sense of what's going on in the field. Did you have a question?
So this you would study of contemplative practice, you would then call contemplative studies.
Yeah.
And the way of doing science is contemplative science. So,
Yeah.
So it could be distinguished like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of contention also because, and I've, as someone who's known sort of as a critic within the field, also like think it's important to talk about contemplative studies because it gives room for the social sciences and the humanities in a way that contemplative science typically doesn't. Because a lot of the funding and research and attention is on neuroscience or on the hard sciences because, you know, they have more influence, right, as you all know. So many prefer the term contemplative studies for that reason. But now it's interesting because just in the last year, they've changed it again from contemplative studies to contemplative science. Now it's contemplative research. So it's an ongoing debate. Where do you put the emphasis? There's a push, I think, in the field too towards transdisciplinarity, and that's where this is also coming from. Because you could say the field is like 30 years old. You know, some of the earlier studies and the development of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is 30 or so years old. But if you look at I didn't include it in this presentation, there's a graph actually that documents the rise of the field in terms of research publications, and it's accelerated almost exponentially in the last 5 to 10 years, so that it really hasn't been a field until, say, the last like decade in terms of the consciousness around it, the amount of work that's being done around it. And so in the earlier studies, it was actually more focused on third person, or in a few cases, second person. And although it's so striking because although we're talking about contemplative practice, which is always first person, right, in the first instance, those first person experiences weren't documented and usually included in studies in a way that integrated those different ways of knowing, you see. So that's the finer point I'm just trying to make, is that you're right. Those different ways of knowings also aren't mutually exclusive and they're not competing with one another. But the field has evolved, become more sophisticated to the extent that those are now integrated more seamlessly. So these contemplative practices that I show you have been around for most of them thousands of years, if not hundreds of years, right? And so there's such a body of knowledge and collective memory around what's going on when one engages in these practices. But often they're within religious contexts that document that through religious scriptures or through also just verbal transference of the tradition and the knowledge and everything else, and they're codified in their in the traditions and the religious traditions they come from. But what's new or novel in this sense is now this field exists within a sort of academic context and a scientific often context, so that we are exploring, like you say, much of the same territory that people have been exploring, but with a new approach, with a new, the empirical methods that are available today weren't available, right, when those practices were originally developed. So it's also about taking the religious scriptures and also Buddhist monastics or Taoist monastics or what have you, who have far more experience personally with these techniques, but then also integrating that with these empirical methods, second and third person ways of knowing, if that makes sense. That's genuinely new. So these are just some other contexts also to consider, both when you're doing studies and when you're doing practice. This was from a lecture, and again, everything is in the bibliography at the end, a lecture by Germano, where he talks about how to be more inclusive and more integrated in how we understand contemplative practice. So these practices, like I said in this diagram, are always embedded within a cultural, social context, and also always in some ways related to these 12 factors. And this just actually came up. What do you mean by meditation? And I wanted to include this because it's a sort of taxonomy of meditation that's in a research study by Cortland Dahl, who's in the field of contemplative studies, who's documented across different traditions what are different meditation practices, right? And how can we group them together? Because some focus more on the cultivation of attention or awareness, some are more constructive, and some are more deconstructive. And I'm not going to go through all of these. You have access to the slides, but just to give you a sense, like in the attentional family, there are these breath counting practices many of you are probably familiar with, where you're just focused on the sensation of the breath in the nose, right, or the belly, and often you count to 10 or something, and then you repeat. Once you get to 10, you go back down to 1, right? But it's training your focus, because every time you lose your focus, you start thinking about something else, then you return to 1. Right, and sometimes I never get up to 10, right, depending on where I'm at. And mindfulness-based stress reduction is also in that family under object orientation. And the point I wanted to make here too is that that's just one of, right, these like 30 or 40 different forms of meditation that he's cataloged. Right? So we shouldn't limit our understanding just to what's sort of popular or mainstream, what we mostly associate meditation with. And then you have, like in the constructive family, forms of meditation, for instance, in the middle, values orientation. Here, there's contemplations on mortality, which exist in many traditions, and which are oriented around a particular way of understanding death. So they're values oriented. And I practiced the Theravada is a particular branch of Buddhism popular in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka. I practiced a contemplation of mortality, which was very interesting because in the meditation hall there was a skeleton, actually, at the front, which confronted you with your own mortality. And then the monastics in the hall took you through a guided meditation where you contemplated your own both impermanence, right, which is an important Buddhist belief, in the sense that it allowed you to realize, right, that we are all subject to aging, sickness, death. And they took you through parts of your body so that you contemplated in this meditation your fingernails, your hair, your skin, your different aspects, you know, and so that you deconstructed your sense of self in a way that allows you to realize that we're all just sort of, right, we're dying all the time, actually. And every death is a new birth, also, in a way, right? Our cellular parts of our body are always regenerating, right? It allows you to become aware of that. And then deconstructive family, probably most of you are aware of like koan practice, right? Like what's the sound of one hand clapping, right? We've all heard that. There are these like paradoxes that your teacher would give you based on where you are at in your development. So it's a sort of phrase or a sentence, a paradox is prescribed to you, and it's your job to figure out the answer. But these paradoxes never make any sense conceptually. So the idea is to sort of go beyond a conceptual understanding of the problem, okay? And that's deconstructive. So these are all not forms of mindfulness, but forms of meditation. And mindfulness meditation in different varieties, because there's mindfulness-based stress reduction, and then there's mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which works with your own belief systems. And there's DBT and other forms, but those are just a subset, right, of meditation. The last slide in this part, I just want to define mindfulness, right? But this is so tricky too, because as many forms of meditation there are just as many, if not more, definitions. And I'm using here Jon Kabat-Zinn's own words because many consider him to be the, quote, father of modern mindfulness, because he developed the secular-based stress reduction techniques 30 so years ago. And in his own words, he sort of contradicts himself, which is really confusing because people, that's why I asked you at the beginning, how do you understand mindfulness meditation? They have like all these different associations and different ideas about it, but even the people who are prescribing mindfulness or developing mindfulness, it seems to me that they don't even have a singular definition. Right? They keep saying different things in different contexts to different people or audiences. And this just gives you a sense for that. So in one conversation, Jon Kabat-Zinn says, mindfulness is a universal and innate human capacity to cultivate moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness. So that's an operational kind of definition. It's moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness. Like you said, it could be an everyday experience. It doesn't have to be sitting on a cushion. It could be while you're cooking, while you're, doing any number of things. And he says it's an innate and a universal capacity. So we all can do this, right? It's an interesting assumption. He also, though, says it's a way of being, it's a way of seeing, it's a way of knowing, maybe even a way of loving. I mean, so that's like, it's like everything, And then he has these more specific definitions where he contextualizes mindfulness in terms of Buddhist tradition. So in the beginning, like these first two I mentioned, it seems like it's universal, it applies to everybody, it has nothing to do with Buddhist tradition, right? But then in other contexts with different people, he specifically speaks of mindfulness as a Buddhist practice. But then he often also speaks of it as a universal, both a universal practice and one that comes from Buddhism, And so he says it's a universal dharma that's coextensive, if not identical, with the teachings of the Buddha, right? Almost like as if if you're interested in Buddhism, you don't need to know anything about Buddhism, but maybe you just learn mindfulness because that's like the same thing, He says it's also maybe a placeholder for the entire Dharma meant to carry multiple meanings and traditions simultaneously. So again, he's conflating the differences also within Buddhism. There's so many different Buddhist traditions without, hundreds and thousands of years history. There's Zen, right? There's Theravada, I said. There's like Tibetan forms of Buddhism, like Dzogchen. There's, But he's saying, well, mindfulness in a way, it exists in all these traditions and the differences don't matter so much. And finally, which is his most specific, he contradicts that again and says that it's one of 7 factors of enlightenment according to the Abhidhamma. And the Abhidhamma is a text. So he's being very specific and saying, actually, within the whole Buddhist tradition, there's this one text and this one tradition that talks about mindfulness. So he goes from the like universal to the very broad to like the most specific. And somehow mindfulness is located where? Somewhere. I don't know. So it's quite confusing, which leads to the second part of my lecture. Because of this kind of confusion, there have been a lot of critiques to critically examine the limitations of mindfulness so that we can work through this confusion and get a little bit of clarity about what we're talking about, when we're talking, what we're doing, and that kind of thing. And just about a year or two years ago, this book called The Handbook of Mindfulness came out, and I'd say that's the best single resource for critiques of mindfulness because it includes like 36 or so different articles. Like it's 600 or 700 pages. It's just like huge, and they're all critiques of mindfulness for the most part. And it's new, it's recent, so there's a lot of good material and information in there. But that just came out a year or so ago. And before that, about 5 years ago, there was this article by a friend of mine, Ron Purser and David Loy, called Beyond McMindfulness, which sort of is important because it went viral. And it was sort of like the height of the like critical or critique of mindfulness like movement. Like people even who never heard much about mindfulness became sort of aware of some of the critics or criticisms. So the next slide, I want to talk about neuroreductionism. It's like, a lot of the science of mindfulness or meditation actually has a lot of problems, right? And to just summarize one of those problems here, I want to talk about this mismatch between like the neuroimaging and what we actually know from that evidence, right? Because neuroimaging is also like in the popular imagination extremely attractive, right? There's a sort of like hype or mania around these like images of brains, and people think like this is evidence, like really hard evidence of the effects of mindfulness on the brain and yada yada yada. But the philosopher Evan Thompson, who's a great scientist within contemplative studies, has this formulation in 3 parts where, he says the proper level of any description of cognitive function, like attention, for example, is not the brain, right? Your mind is not in the brain. It's in your body and it's in your relationships, right? And then he says it's unlikely that there's a one-to-one mapping between cognitive functions like attention and particular area in your brain. But that's what you often find, at least in the media, if not in the studies themselves, that they, through neuroimaging technology, map a brain area, right? And say that that's equivalent to this experience or this, right, outcome, right? Like one-to-one, you know? And that's empirically unwarranted. It's not valid. It's not true, right? To map the functions of the brain and mindfulness meditation in particular onto these, or to map the cognitive functions onto these different areas of the brain. You can't say that this area of the brain is 100% responsible for this experience or this outcome, you know? But you see that, and you see that in this, for instance, image, where this is a meta-analysis, comes from a meta-analysis where they're compiling studies of different kinds of meditations and different outcomes, and they're saying, like, you can see the color codes, right? Focused attention practices is right there. Open monitoring practice is right there. Compassion practice is right there. Like, they activate these different functional areas in the brain, right? So it's important. I mean, I'm sure most of you are aware, like, you can't reduce something as complex as experience, which actually is in the body and in the relationship to something like the brain, and then you can't study the brain in a way that correlates one-to-one, like an area with some experience or outcome. But it's pervasive within the field, actually, if you read the empirical studies. There needs to be a certain humility and a certain critical reflection of what the limitations of this study are. And I think so the first thing to mention is, and we all know probably, like, when it makes the leap from the study to the public through media and reporting, often bad reporting, so much is lost, right? So that's first. But then also, if we just look at the studies, I think often there are some outlandish claims that are made that are unwarranted empirically based on what I just presented too, which we need to be circumspect about, critical about. But what I wouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I wouldn't say neuroscience is bunk. I wouldn't say that it's not a powerful tool for understanding the clinical efficacy, especially of these techniques, because it's tracking biophysically and chemically what's happening when you're engaged in meditation, which could be very important for treating patients. But again, like I said, there's a lot of this misinformation or misunderstanding in the public too when you go from the study to the reporting of it. So there's these graphs right here that show the documented increase in publications within the field. Actually, so I didn't include it. And this is just the last 15 years right here. You know? So it's just like a mega trend now. Even though it existed for, say, 30 or so years, there were just very few studies. And then also, what's interesting is this is the empirical research. This is therapies. And traditional psychotherapy, psychoanalysis is sort of declining or stagnating. And mindfulness is like the new trend or topic. And I also applied to like therapy programs before I did my PhD, and that's what they were really interested in. It was like mindfulness-based therapies. That was like the new trend or new wave of therapy. But with this growing like hype and growing attention, there's a lot of, like I said, misinformation. And so there's this article written by leaders in the field of contemplative studies that's drawing people's attention to this hype and saying we need to be careful, guys, you know, because also there's a danger in so far as people misunderstand, misinterpret, or abuse the science, then that can hurt the field. You know, it can hurt our reputations as scientists. So we need to take responsibility for managing this public dialogue in a way and interfacing with reporters. But here are some reasons why this is happening, nevertheless. So some of the reasons why there are misunderstandings, interpretations, abuses, right, of the studies. One is that there's, you know, economic and cultural values that are incentivizing this kind of misinformation in a way. That when we go to even study meditation, what gets studied is in some ways incentivized. Also, by funding structures or by public interest or economic interest, right? Corporations may be much more interested, or funding agencies may be much more interested in particular outcomes of meditation, like performance enhancement, right? So those are the studies that get done, and that's what gets the attention in the media. So it's important just to remember. Also, there's a prevalence of positive outcomes. That exists across all sciences, It's called the white hat bias. I mean, we don't, like Tom said a couple days ago, tend to publish negative results. We should, because we're all doing those studies. Why do we want to replicate studies if someone's already done it? But what gets the press and what gets the attention are the positive results. And so there's this issue within contemplative studies too. And also there's this constant misunderstanding between what is correlational and what's caused. And there's often a conflation between the two. So people assume that a correlation actually is a direct causation, which is rarely the case. And finally, there's just, from the media side, incentives for clickbait titles and superficial reporting. So you see mindfulness is going to make you really happy, and it's like the secret to any of your problems. And so that's also a constant issue. And just, to that point, here are some examples, the ways in which mindfulness is pervasive now in culture. There's just thousands and thousands of books, mindfulness for law students, mindful parenting, mindful diets, mindful sex. If you own a dog, you could be mindful. And it's not, to your point too, that you can't find value in mindfulness in everyday life, I think. But what I'm drawing attention to is here that it's not a panacea, in the sense that it's not like a cure-all. It's not going to solve all your problems. But that's sometimes the way it's portrayed in media. You just got to be circumspect. And a lot of it is, to your point, been commercialized. And I know for a fact, a lot of my colleagues have been approached by publishers who ask them, can you publish a popular book on mindfulness? And a lot of them are not in the least bit interested, because that's not also what their work is about. But that's what a lot of the publishers are interested in, because they can make money. Another point of critique is around adverse experiences. So there's this study by Willoughby Britton and colleagues, a project she started called The Varieties of Contemplative Experience. And it was really important. She's just now publishing the results from that, because it was a really in-depth study on what comes up during meditation. Because as I said, a lot of the studies had studied positive outcomes. And there wasn't much attention about potential downsides of engaging in meditation practices. But for sort of across the board, for some people, they would have adverse experiences. And I'm sure many of us are aware, when you're engaging in this inner work, stuff just comes up, and it's not easy. And sometimes you touch sensitive areas, or you touch your own suffering or the suffering of others. And that needs to be studied, but also in a way that allows for greater support for people who engage in the techniques. And just to give you some examples, this is just one of several reports. And in that report, which was just a couple of years ago, a woman went to a retreat center, SN Goenka, I think, retreat center, which is pretty popular, but also very intense, and did meditation for a week. They have these quite traditional week-long meditation retreats where you basically sit in a room and sit on a cushion, and even if you're sort of in pain, you persist in meditating, and then you have a teacher who you see every day and who guides you through a growth process. But she, through the experience, became increasingly unstable and complained and expressed her instability and issues to the teachers, but they weren't responsive enough to her condition. And so she left the retreat very distraught and started having dissociative episodes, which is not just her own, but also a common experience with people who engage, especially in deconstructive forms of meditation. They start questioning themselves, right? What is the self? I mean, that's what the techniques sometimes are designed to do. But for some people, that could be extremely destabilizing. And for this individual, she ended up reaching out to the center again after she left by email and not receiving the support that she needed, and committed suicide. So it's serious, and we need to, which is the point of the studies, study and consider adverse experiences in meditation to provide the support that's necessary, and also to tell people whether it's appropriate, because it's not necessarily appropriate for everybody to do particular techniques. And you don't always know, which is the quote. Some people, based on their own biochemistry, their own biography, their own history, are well-positioned to cultivate contemplation, and others aren't. And sometimes you can trigger something, right, through the experience. So we need to be aware of that. We sort of touched on this already, but there's a lot of the critiques and scholarship in this area focus on ethics. Because to Oscar's point, like, there's been this process of translation from East to West that's decontextualized the practices, which in part is responsible for the last slide, right? But which don't include the cultural or social context in which they originally come from. And there's not so much conscious or understanding or critical understanding of the social and cultural context in which they're currently embedded, right? And so as you move away from religious forms of practice to secular forms of practice, there's a lot that's missing, one of which is ethics, right? So there's been a lot of articles written on, is it even appropriate to consider ethics in mindfulness programs? And there's a lot of debate, because also some people like Jon Kabat-Zinn, who've developed the secular techniques, also say that there is already ethics, but it's implicit, right? It's not explicit. It's like if you practice mindfulness, he already believes that you will become more compassionate in a way, even if it's not explicit. He's already converted to that extent that somehow those ethical teachings are like embedded in the practice. But then others don't believe that and think that you need to have an explicit orientation, and in the programs themselves, you need to design them so that there's ethical teaching, or that there's an orientation. But then if you even if you agree with that and consider ethics in a program, what kind of ethics, right? What kind of values? I mean, that's tricky. Is it religious or secular? You don't want to alienate people. You want to invite them into a practice. Do you consider their values in that process? Do you what do you do? One of the examples that's gotten the most attention, which you may have heard of, is shorthand called the mindful sniper. Because also historically, like, we all probably remember in World War II, the Japanese using Zen Buddhism, right? For pretty nefarious purposes. Like the kamikaze pilots would use Buddhist techniques to do what they did, and this has existed across history. So today, the U.S. Army is funding mindfulness programs, giving millions of dollars, so that their soldiers can not just increase attention or concentration so that they can be better snipers, which is true, but also so that they can alleviate their own stress and anxiety when they're in complex environments. And I also can't say that that's necessarily a bad thing, because if you're going to have an army and you're going to have soldiers doing horrendous things, or in just complex environments where they have to be really on point, right? So that they don't shoot a family, so that they shoot, the enemy, right? But still, there are a lot of problems around that we have to consider. So again, the issue, do we include ethics in these, or do we just not question how they're used, A
question would be, how do we, because if you want to have ethics, you have to have something, an institution which can not impose, but regulate or the ethics of it. And that's the hard part. It's like who is in charge, who is responsible for making sure that on one side the US Army is doing that ethically, or that the other side the guy selling an internet course is doing that ethically. Like that is extremely hard. Because as you were saying, mindfulness goes everywhere.
Right.
Into society, so then it's like kind of running after it, and so that's very hard. So is it an institution? Is it
There are, just to go back to this, there are within the literature those who, when they talk about ethics and if they agree that ethics needs to be part of the program or curriculum, let's say we can divide them into two camps, right? Those who are more intent on, maybe not imposing, but affirming the religious ethical traditions that these techniques or practices originally come out of. And so they reaffirm, sometimes in an also fundamentalist way, that these practices needs to go back to the original context. But then there are others, like you sort of alluded to, that agree that we need to orient them around ethics, but they are interested in secular ethics. And that's a huge push now within the field of contemplative studies to fund research and programs on the development of secular ethics. And the Dalai Lama wrote a book actually on secular ethics, in which he said that that's where we need to go. Even as a Buddhist, the Dalai Lama sort of is the now popular figure of Buddhism, says that he doesn't believe people need to become Buddhists, that actually it's fine for those in, the Tibetan diaspora who he works with, but for most people who are interested in mindfulness, he feels it's not important to convert to Buddhism. It's just important to have an ethical sense of compassion and care. So he's the spokesperson for a much larger movement that's funding research into secular ethics. So this is a meditation studio. I like spin class, which is, riding on the bicycle. This is just like the same thing. They have a schedule where you can go for half-hour sessions. And you can also go for private lessons for $160. But it's pictured right there on the left, and it just looks like a sort of bicycle studio for meditation. And it's in New York, so it's very swank and posh. So I think part of it is the sort of status, right? The people that you meet and everything else. But who can afford that? I can't afford, especially to sit on a cushion for that amount of money. do it, at home or at a temple for free. These are just other examples of the sort of commercialization of mindfulness, or mindfulness. So we have mindful mayonnaise. And we also have a pod that you can buy for $35,000. It's supposed to be an ambient environment that allows you to immediately meditate, just like, because it's like soundproof. And I think there's some energy around it, maybe. But it's supposed to get you into that state very quickly. That's And then this other one, which I kind of just have to show you. I can't not. I won't show you the whole thing, but it's like, so KFC, literally, I think it's brilliant, actually. I love it. Came up with these commercials called the Comfort Zone. They're pot pie-based meditation system.
Hello. Does the state of the world have you concerned? You are not alone. What if I told you of a revolutionary system designed to bring comfort to your mind, heart, and stomach? A system that nourishes the mind while nourishing the body. A system that will ease your suffering and your hunger. Join me now for a journey into the comfort zone. Kentucky Fried Chicken's pot pie-based meditation system. Let's begin. Imagine yourself sitting before a KFC pot pie. Or better yet, go get one. Focus your attention on the crust. Can you feel its warmth? Imagine that warmth surrounding you and relax. Now take a deep breath. Inhale the delicious aroma. Visualize the deeper world beneath the crust. Imagine the peas, the carrots, the potatoes. Imagine the tender, juicy morsels of chicken. Now take your spork. Feel the weight of your spork. Imagine your spork as a spoon. Now, imagine your spork as a fork. Now feel them coming together to become your spork. Imagine that your spork is an extension of your hand. Can you feel it? Good.
There's like 6 of these different meditations that, how to eat a pot pie and what have you. And yeah, there was one 6-minute meditation on a spork, and it's a non-dual meditation that takes you through, is it a fork or a spoon? What is the nature of the spork? What's the essence of the spork? Another critique that many people have heard about is the neoliberal critique is like, what does mindfulness have to do with social change, right? Because it seems to be very individualized. It seems to be very sort of isolated from any kind of social engagement, any kind of change in the world. So you have this cartoon right here, right? Like, where this guy is saying, well, I lost my job, and the sort of spiritual sage is saying, well, you've taken early retirement. Like, reframe that, like just change your attitude and everything's going to be okay, Or I lost my house, and the spiritual sage says, you've renounced your worldly possessions. Like, that's a really good thing, be non-materialistic, like don't worry about it. Or I lost my retirement savings, and you say, you live in the moment, And it's hilarious, but also it's a common tendency within a lot of certain spiritual communities to do what's called spiritual bypassing, where they sort of like don't even consider or critically examine like structural or social systems and the ways that they're embedded within those, and just focus on the individual and their own personal experience, and use meditation then to just focus on their emotions and their attitude. And then any sort of stimulus or anything from any outside influence that sort of disturbs their meditative state, right, is perceived to be not just a threat to that meditative state, but is perceived to be something that they can cope with by using meditation to sort of change their attitude or their internal state without questioning how to change the external world, right? So that's sort of spiritual bypassing, is they use the spiritual practices to sort of change their internal disposition in a way that allows them to cope without sort of also challenging the sort of systemic or outside influence. And to just demonstrate that, there's this really good video. It's very short. It's part of a series you probably have heard of, like Humans of New York. And there's this lady who's talking about how this has happened, like in her own experience, because it's pretty common.
Wellness is like being commodified, and everyone's looking in and doing all of this inward reflection. If you're unhappy, it's because of you. Your unhappiness isn't a reflection of any sort of systemic imbalance that we could address together. It's a you problem. I worked the most shit job when I moved back to New York last year. And I was told, instead of me becoming upset because someone's spoken to me in a way that is horrifically disrespectful, unprofessional, and above all else, probably illegal, I was told, you just take a few deep breaths. Maybe you should get the mindful app, the meditation app. Are you serious? The things you're saying are not relevant to the job. Why are you commenting on my body? Why are you making commentary on my weight? Why are you making commentary on my hair, on my... What does that have to do with this job? I bring my body to work and I do my job. And don't tell me to meditate my frustration away, because my frustration is valid and it's real and it's coming from a genuine place. And I wouldn't be frustrated if it didn't matter.
Another critique is the decolonial critique. So with the sort of secularization of mindfulness, you often find this retranslation of mindfulness from Eastern culture to Western culture. But what's interesting in that process is often that the mindfulness experts tend to be white male experts who don't necessarily come from those traditions, like Jon Kabat-Zinn, for instance, and who speak on behalf of the practices and the traditions in a way that often erases the cultural history, where these techniques come from, who also supports the techniques, and by the way, like, who is the majority of people practicing, even in secular Western societies. So just to put a finer point on that, in the United States, for example, the majority of Buddhists are Asians. Most of them also don't necessarily practice meditation, but those who do are Asians, they're not white. But yet the spokespeople for mindfulness or for meditation or for these techniques often are like white males, and they don't give recognition or visibility to that kind of history. So there's a sort of process of colonization that's often happening that's tied up also with white supremacy, and it's often never recognized. So you have like mindful magazines and people who've become famous because of their role in shaping the mindfulness movement as leaders of the mindfulness movement, but they're very predominantly male and white. And so that's sort of an issue within the movement. But what's also really interesting is to contrast the sort of current state of the mindfulness movement with its origins. The birth of mindfulness meditation actually comes from a decolonial context. So it comes from right here, Burma. On the left, there's a book called The Birth of Insight that documents the history of the birth of mindfulness. And it was originally developed by this Burmese monk who's pictured right there in a British colonial context. What he did was he decided to maintain the integrity of Buddhist traditions in Burma by developing mindfulness as a way to contain that tradition, okay, against the incursion and influence of British colonizers within that country. And then he disseminated the technique of mindfulness outside as a way to sort of salvage Buddhist tradition. So it's really interesting because mindfulness, most people don't realize, comes out of this decolonial context. So they were using mindfulness to sort of salvage the integrity of Buddhism under the oppressive influence of the British. But this is what we typically see today in the secular mindfulness movement in Western countries, that it's dominated by a sort of lack of diversity and a sort of lack of recognition of those who developed the techniques and what have you. So why is like the face of the mindful movement this beautiful white blonde woman on Time magazine? You know, that's like an open question. It's like, you know, there's certainly some problems with that, I think. And here's Jon Kabat-Zinn in dialogue with Angela Davis, who is both a mindfulness and Buddhist practitioner and this brilliant social activist. And she's talking to Jon Kabat-Zinn about what's the relationship between mindfulness and social change which we're all in this class interested in. And Kabat-Zinn says that from his perspective, when social justice and activism come together with what he calls the Dharma, wisdom, in a universal framework, so that it's really for everybody and not just an ism of one sort or another, he sees mindfulness as a kind of transformative practice capable of moving the bell curve of the entire society towards a new way of understanding what it means to be human. This is really high rhetoric about the power of mindfulness to shape society. He says, what I'm talking about, just to be clear, is the liberative power of the Dharma. And here he uses big D, which denotes like Buddhist Dharma, right? How universal is that? And then Angela Davis, this mindfulness practitioner, social activist, challenges him and says, I'm really asking also about what you mean by we, like, because Kabat-Zinn sort of just uses this we without even questioning who does he consider to be in that we. He seemingly speaks of mindfulness and also Buddhism in a universal way, without recognizing different social locations, in particular his own social location as a white male, And then he responds to Angela saying, oh yeah, maybe that's my white privilege, using we, in this way that's almost colonizing, that doesn't consider like my own location, like as a white man speaking on behalf of others, right? And this relates also to the field you were speaking of, the academic studies of mindfulness and meditation, because there's still like this push to universalize, generalize, as science often tries to do, experience, like to say that mindfulness both is sort of one size fits all, and that this is what the outcomes that are provided by mindfulness, and this is what we can expect. So it's a lot of the mindfulness studies are investigating what I'd call the genetic structures, the general structures of human experience, using neural mechanisms, microphenomenology, and different theories of mind, but without recognizing the situatedness, right? Different social locations, how maybe different identities, different people experience these practices differently, right? Most of the science tends to generalize and wash over differences. So I just want to say that it's really important as researchers, people interested in this field, to, in our study and implementation of these practices, recognize history, society, and the environment. So, as I sort of said, most of the contemplative scholars who are doing the studies, getting the attention, are white experts from Western countries. The sciences have most of the influence and funding, so the humanities gets very little. And those who are part of the humanities within this field are mostly like Buddhist scholars, which is a really small subset of what should be the case. We should have more representation from other traditions, right? Not just Buddhists. And even within that small circle of Buddhist scholars, they're not just any Buddhists, they're mostly like Tibetan Buddhists, those who associate with Dalai Lama, or those also who are interested in Vipassana, which is a kind of traditionally Thai form of like mindful breathing exercise, mindful meditation, right? So we're not looking at the full breadth of practices. We're just pretty narrowly focused within the field. And also neuroscientific perspectives are privileged. So as a result, this has been going on for forever, but finally in the last 5 years, there have been all these critiques, right, that have been getting public attention, so that the field is now finally responding to some of these critiques. And so the preeminent professional organization called Mind and Life that organizes a lot of the research has just in a year or so created this diversity and inclusion like initiative with, like a lot of schools now have like diversity initiatives or departments to sort of tackle the issue. And there's problems around that, but that's their sort of response. So at least something's happening around that. This concludes part 2 of the critiques, and I just wanted you to sort of each pick a critique that resonates with you. Any of them. It could be the neoliberal critique, the decolonial critique, it could be the one I mentioned on adverse experiences, right? It could be neuroreductionism or the way that science is done. It could be bad reporting. It could be, any of those that I mentioned, and just think about that within your own working context. It doesn't even necessarily have to be about mindfulness, certainly, or about contemplative practice, but how was this critique as a lens? How could it illustrate or elucidate, bring to light some issues within your own working context? And just spend just a minute or so. And then I'd like to hear a couple answers if you could. So how does all that I built up, the context and the critiques, apply to sustainability? And I'd like to start from, again, another quote from the same dialogue between Angela Davis and Jon Kabat-Zinn that demonstrates the relation between social change and mindfulness. So Angela Davis says, and she's challenging again Kabat-Zinn, I want to press you on this question of structural transformation. I totally understand how it might be possible to encourage individual police officers to engage in mindful practices so that they might not be so quick to racially profile. But I don't know whether it's possible to effect the kind of structural transformation that way. Because if one looks at the institution of policing, not just the individuals, and its histories, particularly its racist history in this country, the United States, there is so much that has to be addressed. And individuals are not always aware of the extent to which they embody their histories. They don't understand, many of us don't understand the extent to which we inhabit and are inhabited by our histories. And Kabat-Zinn says he totally agrees, but then he asks if mindfulness can easily be co-opted in the way she describes and kept at a level where it doesn't really change structures or systems because the institutions are self-preserving. Then he asks, what do you see as an effective alternative? It's another sort of moment, like you said, where he gets caught and he sort of admits to the accuracy or truth of what she says, and yet doesn't have or hasn't thought enough about the solution of how to negotiate that tension between the mismatch of current mindfulness practices, their focus on the individual, and the desire for social change. And that's what I want to focus on now, because we all are interested in that. That's what this course is about, right? So another way to divide mindfulness, this is to Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I think it's helpful, is in 4 ways. One is the classical forms that we're familiar with in, say, Buddhist or Taoist or what have you traditions, and that's their sort of, quote, original religious context in Asian countries. And the purpose of those practices, in this case mindfulness, is to overcome suffering. From a Buddhist understanding, it's to overcome samsara. And samsara is the cycle of life and death. So it has what we'd call a soteriological purpose, right? It's focused on salvation, on liberation from this cycle of life and death, of rebirth, right? But that's a very particular religious understanding of what mindfulness is. Another form of mindfulness, and this is a grouping, is the therapeutic forms that you mentioned earlier, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, but also mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and other forms of therapeutic mindfulness that focus on alleviating distress, right? And that are very helpful within a clinical or medical context. And then the third grouping is instrumental. How can we use mindfulness and these practices to enhance some outcome that we find desirable, like performance or focus or concentration or what have you, right? And last is the fourth, how can we use mindfulness and contemplative practice for change, social change? And that's the one I think gets the least attention, but that's the one we're all interested in. The difference between the first 3 and the last one, though, is also this focus on the individual versus an understanding of the individual in context, in relationship to others and social systems and ecology.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. Because under the classical, it's one small part of Buddhism in this case. And Buddhism in general is also the Union King Sutra and other have a lot of teachings about good governance and social network as well. But it's easy to confuse mindfulness with this classical heading as if it's synonymous with Buddhism when it's not in this case, no?
So I guess a couple of things. I mean, so this is Bhikkhu Bodhi's sort of taxonomy. Yeah, in this case, he's speaking of the classical Buddhist. And you're right. The classical Buddhist forms of mindfulness are related to all of those teachings, which are often inherently social and often talking about, you could call it social change in many ways. Like, for instance, like Pure Land Sutra. I mean, things like that. They're like utopias. They're orienting you to a particular vision of reality or what you want to aspire to, which is social. And often also the practices you see in the picture are within a social context. They're not just practiced individually in a Western setting, but they're communal. They're shared. So you're totally right. But I think what he's trying to draw our attention to is the way we also understand social change, activism, especially sustainability in our context, is often a bit different than the way Buddhists would use mindfulness to, like, you said, understand social change or the communal context, because it's wrapped around the religious worldview that they come from. And here's another, this is actually my own formulation of different ways of understanding the inner and outer, mindfulness and sustainability. So one way to go about it is to just take these two things for granted. And so here's mindfulness, and then here's sustainability, and how do we find the middle ground? And you could do this in the research literature, and it's often done like, there are studies of mindfulness that are associated to particular outcomes, like pro-social behavior, compassion, reduced consumer behavior, consumption patterns, etc. And that's related to sustainability in some way. And then you find this middle ground, right? Another way to go about it, number two, is to look at the impact of mindfulness on sustainable outcomes or sustainability. So this unidirectional like causation, right? So number one is more like correlation. Number two is like a causation from the direction of the inner to the outer. And then three is looking at causation from inner, outer, and outer, inner. Okay, what I would say maybe is like ecologically engaged mindfulness, using mindfulness in this way. And finally, four is relational kind of approaches to mindfulness, which as a project in Potsdam, that's what we tried to figure out, right? How did these practices work across levels and scales in a way that's genuinely integrative also, and this is what I'll get to next, so that we're not just taking mindfulness and sustainability for granted and doing this kind of mapping work, but that we're actually questioning also what is mindfulness and what is sustainability, and designing and experimenting around this integration, right? If that makes sense. So as a field, contemplative studies has particular biases also, and these are the disciplines where most of the work is done. But you can see, like, even though the three big categories, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, are represented, there are only a few disciplines within those that are primarily represented. And within the humanities, it's like a very small group, just like mostly the religious philosophical traditions that sort of, like I said, bring the textual sources or the understanding from the traditions into play. And from the social sciences, it's mainly sociology or anthropology or psychology. And the natural sciences, like neuroscience, it's primarily neurobiological or biochemical. But what's missing, guys, like economics, political scientists, like environmental studies, it's not there. I've gone to the professional association meetings, and there are very few political scientists, environmental scholars, and what have you. And so the current state of the research on mindfulness or contemplative practice is confined to a few things. One is a biomedical paradigm, where it's understood to be an intervention, something that you use for therapeutic purposes. Also, because of these biases, there's a tendency towards reductionism as opposed to synthesis, right? Also, there's very little of this work that's done outside of academia with other stakeholders, which is going to be really important for us, I think. To interface between academia and non-academia, between government, business, civil society, and how they might be interested in working with contemplative practice. And so as a result of all of these accumulated biases, transformation is conceived, again, to be more either individual or interpersonal, social, but usually not socio-ecological, systemic. Okay? There are a few exceptions, but by and large, the contemplative practices haven't reached the level of systemic change. And again, this is the current sort of practices that most scholars are working with, but if you think about each of those, you find, well, still, like, how many of those really address the structural or systemic? This kind of gets to your also question of like, well, how do you take ethical responsibility and professional responsibility for the practices? And these are just some suggestions. There's 10 guidelines that a colleague and I published to sort of address that issue. So after we sort of go through the critiques, right, we sort of think, well, how can we address those? And one way is that mindfulness as a technique should also be coupled with a clear comprehension, sort of critical understanding of oneself in the world, And also, if it's in the context of corporate mindfulness, they should also not just focus on the individual, but also the culture, the corporation's culture, right? Like, if you're focused on reducing your own stress, maybe you ought to also, in addition, question, where's the stress coming from? And if it's coming from the corporate culture or the environment around or what have you, you don't want to only, it's still important, but you don't want to only alleviate your stress, but also address the source of the stress. Number 3 is, as I said, sort of mindfulness isn't value-free. We all shape it in some ways according to our values. It's not just a technique. The purpose and quality of it depends on the context. It's not that commodification is inherently wrong, but you have to be careful of how commodification shapes mindfulness. You want to offer full disclosure, because often this is interesting, like there's conflicts of interest across the whole field, which are never usually either public or explicit. So the people who are doing the studies, who are giving the techniques and selling the programs are usually the same people. So it's important to make that explicit if you want to be responsible and ethical. And then, like you just said in your own coaching practice, don't oversell it. Be humble and sort of scientific in your assessment of what you're doing. And then somehow, whether it's religious or secular, there should be some kind of ethical orientation. And it's a suggestion, but since it's not a value-free practice, you're somehow always doing it anyway. You might as well make it explicit. And finally, although stress reduction, well-being, and happiness are important, that shouldn't be the only thing, because typically the practice or the media focuses just on that, right? And if we want to also think of social change, get away from just that focus. Here's another example from Rachel Lilly. She's a researcher out of the UK. She worked with a few people, and this is in your optional, I think, reading list, but it's like a program that she developed that you can look at that integrates mindfulness with this behavioral economics and behavior change within the context of policymakers in the UK. So it's just an interesting example I wanted to point to see how this integration could happen. So she's working with different government agencies across the United Kingdom and using mindfulness in addition to other practices that elucidate your biases and sort of take you through dialogues. To do that, she's outlined each of these because there's 8 sessions, sort of like the practice lab, that each focus on different ones. One of those sessions, too, is on ecology and the environment. So the point that I'm just trying to make, too, is that mindfulness or contemplative practice could be integrated with other practices in a way that makes the relation to the environment or society more explicit. And Christine herself, in her review of the field, identifies like some categories where research has already happened that are relevant to sustainability. And these are some of those categories, like social activism was mentioned, behavior regulation, human nature connection, consumption behavior. Mindfulness has an impact on all of these that we could work with. One of the ways it impacts consumption is that it calls into question the difference between what you need and what you desire, right? Like it starts allowing you a space of greater awareness around what is it that you actually desire. Are those desires that are socially constructed or influenced from outside, maybe media, advertising, friends, peer groups? Are they intrinsic or extrinsic, right? So it's just, mindfulness is a really good technique to consider your consumption practices. And there's another report by Tim Jackson in the optional reading list, I think, for today's class. The focus is just on mindfulness and consumption. And here I pulled just from a single page 4 ways in which mindfulness impacts consumption. First, it can reveal underlying social and psychological drivers of consumption practices, which include identity, value, and meaning. It can also help us explore our sense of ourselves without requiring material goods to facilitate, our security and our well-being. Mindfulness can enable us to act on our values that support lower consumption, like non-materialistic values. It can help us remain discerning about societal values, less prone to external norms and more resistant to cultural cues, such as advertising. It can help us adhere more closely to our own intrinsic values. And finally, he says, mindfulness may also offer us a sense of meaning through our increased connectedness with ourselves, others, in the world. These are some what are called action logics, which are linked to mindfulness, but also to environmental behavior. One is increasing time frame, to consider not just today, but next generations. And also to see something so removed as climate change is not something so distant, something that you can maybe relate to within your own experience. You can also use these techniques to expand your perspective so that you consider the perspective of others. So you're not so, through the use of these techniques, so embedded within your own sense of the world, but start to get distance on that. What was mentioned before, too, of not just automatically reacting or thinking a certain way, but getting some distance on that, observing your own mind, right? And then through that experience, allowing yourself space to consider the perspective of others. And there's practices I could also link you to that do that. Another is widening circles of concern so that you become more compassionate, in a sense, for other beings. It's especially prominent within eco-psychology, right? This sort of eco-consciousness that develops with some techniques or practices. Another is a greater capacity to handle complexity. We talked about like this interesting tension between dissonance, and action. And I think some of these inner transformation technologies allow you to hold tension, right? And not be so reactive in a way that you're closing possibilities, and you're sort of so uncomfortable in that tension that you sort of act very reactively, without that space or that distance. So these practices can allow you the more capacious ability to hold tension, hold discomfort. They can also decrease prejudice and exclusion of others, or decrease identification with your own worldview, which I mentioned. Let's see, how much time? Okay, so for the sake of time, there's this exercise which I'm going to skip. But before I skip it, I'll mention in case you want to do it in your own time. And it's nothing fancy. It's applying the critique that you chose last time when we, to your work context in a way that incorporates the insights from that critique in a constructive way. Because it's not just that we want to critique, we also want to address the substance of that critique. So you could think maybe after class, like how the critique, like decolonial perspective, is really relevant to you in this moment. But then what does that elucidate for you? What does that help you to understand in a way that then motivates you to move forward, to address the underlying substance of that critique. And how might inner transformation or meditation like help that, facilitate that process, actually, of incorporating the critique into your own work? This is the last part of the lecture, which is how to integrate, to your point, like mindfulness and social change, by shifting the object of contemplation, right? Within contemplative studies, there's sort of a sub field actually called contemplative pedagogy, and there's another professional association called the Academy for Contemplative Mind and Higher Education. It's long, ACME, but it's focused just on contemplative pedagogy. And I actually find that more interesting because primarily it's people from education, but it's from all different departments. And that's why it's more interesting to me, because people are focused mainly not on just the empirical or basic science research, but on the design of curricula for different subject fields. So you actually, in that professional organization, have people from environmental studies and political science and alternative fields who are using and adapting inner transformation for their subject fields. Okay, and these are just two books that are examples of one. I saw this in Christine's office yesterday, Contemplative Approaches to Sustainability, where about a dozen professors interested in environmental studies adapt these practices, so you can read about that. And another focused on social justice, and Beth Barilla is a colleague in gender studies, women's studies department, who's using these for anti-oppression pedagogy. Here's an example of a practice that gets you a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about integration. So it starts off very traditional, like a meditation. It asks you to go to a safe, sort of quiet space and sit down, and then close your eyes, and then move your attention across your body to relax your muscles, and then to breathe deeply. So it's very traditional, right? Very classical. But then something interesting happens. Okay, it shifts the object of contemplation, like I said, from something traditional like the breath to something like fossil fuels. And then it asks you to listen to your environment, to identify which of the sounds in your environment is related to fossil fuel consumption. Right? Is there an imbalance between the sounds and fossil fuels? Right? How do you feel about that? What's dominating your attention? So this is what I mean by integration. It's like, how do you adapt these technologies for sustainability to bring greater awareness to our relationship to sustainability? And here are a bunch of other examples. Okay, the ones, I think the first 5 that I listed are also all in your either required or optional reading. So Karen Litfin wrote this really good article in it's called like Person, Planet, Politics. It's actually like only 10 pages or so that you can read if you haven't. And she gives a few exercises, like one called Who Am I in a Changing Climate, which asks you to consider your relationship to climate change. Another is Mindful Mall Walking, which I find fascinating because it takes something so traditional like mindful walking, which we all know, but puts you in a mall and asks you to contemplate your relationship to consumer objects in a neutral way. So she takes you through like a guided meditation, and she asks you to go to the mall and start walking without buying anything, but just to witness, to observe your own thoughts, your own reactions, your own feelings when you're walking mindfully through the mall. Another is The Hidden Life of a Strawberry. So it starts off just like if you know the raisin exercise, where you take a raisin and then you feel the texture in your mouth and how it tastes. In this case, it's a strawberry. But then it asks you to consider, where did the strawberry come from? What are the production, the distribution cycles of the strawberry? You know, who's involved in bringing the strawberry to you on your table? You know, so it's within the context of sustainability. Joanna Macy has a whole set of trainings called The Work That Reconnects that adapt inner transformation to sustainability contexts. So I certainly would recommend you guys look at that. And then I just personally, I listed at the bottom sort of some outcomes and orientations that connect sustainability with these practices. You know, we can use these practices to build personal community resilience, to offer trauma-informed therapy for people suffering climate disasters like fires, wildfires, droughts, you know, hurricanes. And that's actually already being done. It's documented. I can show you reports of that. We can also use it to prevent burnout for activists, environmental activists, for example. We can develop ecological consciousness, right? The idea of including any number of beings within your circle of concern. Use it to curb addictions or addictions to consumer objects. You can also use these techniques to imagine futures or to decrease prejudice and identification with your own worldview. And again, actually, although this is like below the radar and it's not getting a lot of attention, it's happening all over. And again, I'm happy to work with you guys and like share resources and knowledge on where it's happening and how. But here's an example. A lot of people know Black Lives Matter, but what they don't know is that the members of Black Lives Matter are quite spiritual and come from often like Christian traditions, contemplative traditions, and African religious traditions. And here's a picture, famous picture of an anti-police brutality protester in Baton Rouge, which is in Louisiana. And look how she's so stoically composed in the face of injustice, you know? Yeah, it's astonishing. And we were talking yesterday at coffee, which is brilliant, like how many social movements historically have been infused with spiritual values? How many have had a sort of sense of moral purpose, right? Think of the civil rights movement. You think of all the sort of social movements and how spirituality is like really central. And here are some organizations that are actually doing this work of integration between mindfulness and social change. Ecodharma is a center in the Pyrenees between Spain and France. It's in Spain, in Catalonia, actually, and I was just there a few months ago. They're doing phenomenal work integrating ecology and contemplative practice. And they offer courses throughout the year on both contemplative practice and things like permaculture and resiliency and sort of social literacy and community building and organizing, and they combine and integrate these different practices and resources. Another center, ULEX, which is a sort of further development of Ecodharma, but it's secular, whereas Ecodharma tends more towards Buddhist or religious practices, and that's in Spain. Courage of Care Coalition is sort of based in San Francisco, but has affiliates all across the United States who are working, I mentioned yesterday, across social activism, social services, and education primarily to work on contemplative practice and social change. And Buddhist Peace Fellowship has a long history of Buddhist and activist work where they're integrating these. This is just an example of like my own sort of contemplative practice. Like I told you I love film, I also love photography, and at one point I did a study of trees. And it really allowed me to perceive trees in a different way. So there is forming this connection that I had with nature through the experience of photographing in a contemplative way. And then contemplative cinema, this is the final slide, what I want to present now, one of my personal practices, and I'll share a video that I made that's just like 7 minutes that allows you to experience what I mean by this kind of integration, where I want to use contemplative practice, but rather than just focusing on my individual well-being, I want to contemplate social suffering or ecological suffering, right? And start to think about my relationship to sustainability. So I have brief sort of set of instructions to sort of cultivate this contemplative disposition while you're watching the film. And the first is to, before you watch, set an intention so that you invite yourself into a space of contemplation. You know, why are we going to watch this, right? And then while you watch, consider your reactions, just like you said, to what you watch, right? Positive or negative, comfortable, discomfortable, like what is coming up for you, right? Just witness that, observe that, right? And then notice how you make sense of what you're seeing, right? Is there like a cognitive or perceptual like overlay? Like, are you interpreting things or not? You know, what's going on internally? And then after we watch, I just want to give you guys like at least 3, if not 5 minutes to just sit, because also these things can be quite provocative, but I want you to sit too and maybe journal just to write down what came up for you, right? And then if we have time, maybe you can discuss now or even after class with your partner what your experience was. And so right before I show it, also, like, it's important for the reasons you mentioned to present these kinds of practices in a sort of ethical and professional way, where you allow people also not to participate, and that you prepare them for what they will participate in. And in this case, I just say that because I'm contemplating social suffering or my relationship to the environment, it could be disturbing for individuals. So I always often like offer this sort of warning, right? That some content could be disturbing, right? So now, yeah, go ahead.
What do you mean by set an intention?
Yeah. So maybe I just speak from my own experience. Not just in this case, but when I watch contemplative film as a sort of practice, I often enter the experience with a certain intention to, like you said, sort of cultivate this capacity to expand my awareness and also to expand my concern. And I'm very intentional in the way that I engage this space. So I don't usually always do this too. Like, I usually just watch popcorn flicks or whatever, you know? And so when I decide to watch a contemplative film, it's a conscious decision. And then I often like do it alone or with people who are also interested in it, and really give my full focus and attention to the film and select the film. Like, I'm very particular about it. And often I can personally consider the film itself to be, in a sense, a sacred object. And I sort of approach it that way, if that makes sense. And I didn't include it here. You can even just Google, like, I wrote just a very short like blog article. It's contemplative eco cinema. And it has like a dozen examples of what are these films that I'm talking about, where this practice is also presented, and how I approach the film in a contemplative way. So you could, if you want to find more information, you could do that. All right. So just 1 minute, and then I'll play the film. And so just get comfortable. It's like 7 minutes, and yeah. Just take 1 minute and silence. You can journal or just reflect. So that's the conclusion, unfortunately. Like I said, all of the sort of materials are here. I think I gave it to Sun already. She can give it to you, and that's the contact info that most of you have. I'll be here in a month. It was so nice to meet you. Hope to see you again. Yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. And thank you for being here.